The moment they laughed at the quiet woman in the corner, they unknowingly set in motion the day that would change every one of their lives. Rain hammered against the windows of the small roadside diner outside Cedar Falls, turning the parking lot into a mirror of gray skies and flashing headlights. Inside, the lunch crowd buzzed with conversation until the front door creaked open and an elderly white man stepped inside, soaked to the bone, his worn jacket dripping onto the tile floor. He looked exhausted rather than dangerous, hungry rather than threatening, but appearances have always been the easiest lies to believe. Several customers immediately looked away. One mother quietly pulled her young son closer. A businessman in an expensive charcoal suit frowned with visible annoyance before returning to his phone. The manager, Linda Brooks, crossed her arms before the man had spoken a single word. "Sir, if you're not ordering, you can't stay here." Her voice carried across the room just enough for everyone to hear. The old man nodded politely, lowering his eyes. "I only hope to warm up for a minute." Before he could finish, Linda pointed toward the door. "This isn't a shelter." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the diner. Nobody intervened. At a nearby table, Nora Bennett, a 36-year-old waitress with neatly tied blonde hair and a faded blue uniform, froze while balancing 2 plates of pancakes. She had spent the morning apologizing for things that weren't her fault, smiling through rude customers, and calculating whether the cash in her purse would stretch until payday. Yet the expression on the old man's face reminded her of something she could not ignore. As she quietly set the plates down, Linda noticed immediately. "Nora," she snapped, "don't even think about it. We've got paying customers." The businessman finally looked up with an amused grin. "Let him go somewhere else," he muttered loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. "People like that always have another story." Soft laughter followed. Nora felt every eye shift toward her. The room seemed smaller, the silence heavier. She knew exactly what would happen if she challenged her manager in front of customers. She also knew she would never forgive herself if she stayed still. Without saying a word, she removed her apron, reached into her pocket, and counted the few wrinkled bills she had planned to use for her own lunch. It wasn't much, barely enough for a sandwich and coffee, but it was everything she had until Friday. "Please," Linda warned, her cheeks reddening. "Don't embarrass this business." Another customer shook his head. "She never learns." The businessman chuckled. "Kindness doesn't pay rent." Nora walked past every staring face, ignoring the whispers that followed her. She handed the old man the money first, then quietly asked the cook to prepare the hottest bowl of soup on the menu. The cook hesitated, glancing nervously toward Linda before silently beginning the order. A hush settled across the diner. Even those pretending not to watch found themselves watching. Linda exhaled sharply. "If you're buying meals for strangers, don't expect extra shifts next week." The words landed harder than she intended. Nora lowered her eyes for only a second before answering softly. "He deserves to eat." The businessman leaned back in his booth, almost entertained now. "You're risking your job over someone you'll never see again." The old man finally looked directly at Nora. His pale blue eyes, unusually calm despite everything, rested on the small name tag pinned to her uniform. Nora Bennett. He read it slowly, almost memorizing each letter. Then something unexpected happened. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. It wasn't gratitude alone. It looked closer to recognition. "Some kindness," he said quietly, "always finds its way home." Before Nora could ask what he meant, the old man accepted the bowl of soup with both hands, his fingers trembling slightly against the warm ceramic. Outside, the rain continued falling, washing the parking lot clean while no one inside realized that by this time tomorrow, luxury SUVs would fill those same spaces. Powerful people would walk through those same doors asking only one question, and every person who had laughed at the quiet waitress would wish they had chosen a different audience for their judgment. Nora remained beside the counter until the old man finished every spoonful of soup in complete silence. Around the diner, conversations slowly resumed, but they carried a different tone now. Customers glanced toward her with expressions that ranged from pity to quiet disbelief, as though she had willingly stepped outside the invisible rules everyone else accepted. Linda Brooks marched into the kitchen with clipped footsteps and folded her arms tightly across her chest. "Office. Now." Nora removed her apron without protest and followed her manager into the cramped room behind the pantry where faded schedules and unpaid invoices covered the bulletin board. Linda closed the door with a sharp click and stared at her for several long seconds before speaking. "Do you know what you just did?" Nora answered honestly. "I bought someone lunch." Linda let out a frustrated laugh. "No, you embarrassed this restaurant in front of paying customers. They come here for comfort, not to watch charity performances." Nora lowered her eyes but refused to apologize for something she did not regret. He was cold and hungry. Linda shook her head. "You keep making decisions with your heart instead of your head. That is exactly why you are still living paycheck to paycheck." The words landed with uncomfortable precision because they were painfully close to the truth. Nora rented a tiny apartment across town, drove a 12-year-old sedan that rattled every morning, and stretched every dollar until it almost disappeared. She knew what it meant to choose between replacing worn shoes or paying another utility bill. Yet none of those struggles had convinced her to stop seeing people as human beings first. Linda scribbled something onto next week's schedule without looking up. "Your shifts have been reduced. Maybe that will remind you this is a business." Nora felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach, but she simply nodded. Arguing would not restore the lost hours. She quietly thanked Linda for letting her know and walked back into the dining room. The businessman in the charcoal suit was standing near the register preparing to leave. His expensive watch caught the afternoon light as he smirked at her. "Still think kindness pays?" he asked. Nora offered a polite smile. "Sometimes it does, just not in the way people expect." He chuckled dismissively before disappearing through the front door, convinced he had won the exchange. Outside, the rain had softened into a light drizzle. The elderly man had already finished eating and was carefully folding the paper napkin beside his empty bowl. Nora approached with a gentle smile. "Would you like me to call someone for you?" The old man slowly rose to his feet. Up close, despite the worn clothing, there was an unmistakable dignity in the way he carried himself. His posture remained straight. His voice never trembled. "Someone is already looking for me," he replied calmly. Nora assumed he meant a relative or perhaps a social worker. "I hope they find you soon." He reached into his pocket as though searching for a wallet, then paused. "I seem to have left everything behind today." Nora smiled warmly. "Do not worry about paying. It has already been taken care of." The old man looked directly into her eyes again, studying her face as though committing every detail to memory. "Most people spend their lives hoping someone important notices them," he said softly. "The remarkable ones notice people who seem unimportant." Before Nora could answer, a dark sedan rolled slowly into the parking lot across the street. The driver scanned the area anxiously before continuing down the road without stopping. The old man's eyes followed the vehicle for only a brief moment before returning to Nora. "Tomorrow will be a busy day for you," he said with quiet certainty. Nora laughed politely, believing he was simply trying to express gratitude. "Tomorrow is Tuesday. Tuesdays are never busy around here." The old man smiled once more, adjusted his worn jacket, and stepped into the cool afternoon air. Nora watched him disappear around the corner until he was completely out of sight. She had no way of knowing that across the state, dozens of people were already searching desperately for the missing father of one of the wealthiest families in America, and that before sunrise, every road leading towards Cedar Falls would carry people whose lives revolved around one urgent question. Where was the quiet waitress named Nora Bennett? That evening, Cedar Falls settled into its familiar rhythm. Streetlights reflected across damp sidewalks, the last diners drifted home, and the little restaurant grew quiet again. Nora wiped down the empty tables one by one, trying not to think about the missing hours on next week's schedule. Every swipe of the cloth reminded her that kindness had once again come with a price. She finished her shift just after 9 o'clock, collected the small envelope holding her tips, and counted the bills beneath the yellow glow of the parking lot light. It was enough to cover groceries for several days, but barely enough to replace the wages she had already lost. Even so, she did not regret buying that bowl of soup. Some decisions were simply too important to measure in dollars. Across town, however, an entirely different night was unfolding. Inside a sleek glass office overlooking the city skyline, Ethan Blackwood stood beside a conference table covered with maps, photographs, and ringing telephones. His normally composed expression had disappeared hours ago. Every executive in the room understood the gravity of the situation. Richard Blackwood, founder of one of the largest investment firms in the country and Ethan's father, had vanished nearly 24 hours earlier after quietly leaving a private medical retreat. Security teams had searched airports, hotels, hospitals, and highways without success. The local authorities had found no signs of foul play, only scattered reports from people who believed they had seen an elderly man walking alone in the rain. Ethan listened carefully as another investigator entered the room carrying a small notebook sealed inside a plastic evidence bag. This was recovered from a public bench about 15 miles outside Cedar Falls, the investigator explained. There was only one page with fresh writing. Ethan immediately opened the notebook. Most pages contained faded personal reflections, but near the back one sentence had been written in careful handwriting only hours before. It read, "The waitress named Nora Bennett still reminds me that kindness survives where wealth cannot buy it." Ethan read the sentence twice. The room became completely silent. "Find her," he said calmly. No one questioned the order. Within seconds, assistants were searching employment records while security specialists contacted every restaurant in Cedar Falls. At nearly the same moment, Nora unlocked the door to her tiny apartment and stepped inside carrying a single grocery bag. The building was old, the hallway lights flickered, and the radiator groaned every few minutes. But she had learned to appreciate small comforts. She placed a carton of milk inside the refrigerator, folded her uniform neatly across a chair, and smiled as she remembered the old man's gentle words. "Tomorrow will be a busy day for you." She quietly laughed to herself. "You were kind," she whispered into the empty apartment. "But you were definitely wrong about that." Before going to bed, she opened the small wooden box where she kept family photographs. One picture showed her late mother serving meals at a community kitchen. As a little girl, Nora had once asked why they kept helping strangers when they barely had enough themselves. Her mother had smiled and answered, "The people who need compassion the most rarely arrive looking important." That lesson had never left her. Shortly after midnight, dozens of black sport utility vehicles began leaving Blackwood headquarters in different directions. One convoy turned toward Cedar Falls. Another headed for neighboring counties. Helicopters prepared for sunrise searches while lawyers, executives, and security directors canceled every meeting on their calendars. None of them cared about stock prices or business negotiations anymore. The only priority was finding Richard Blackwood. And somewhere among the endless lists of names and addresses, one ordinary waitress with a faded blue uniform had suddenly become the most important person any of them needed to meet before the morning was over. The alarm rang at 5:30 the next morning, long before the sun climbed above the rooftops of Cedar Falls. Nora, dressed in the same carefully pressed blue uniform, tied her blonde hair into a neat ponytail, and drove her aging sedan through quiet streets still covered in the silver glow of dawn. Nothing about the morning suggested her life was about to change. She worried about the reduced hours on next week's schedule, mentally calculated her rent payment, and wondered whether she could postpone replacing the worn tires on her car for one more month. When she pulled into the diner parking lot, she noticed Linda Brooks already standing outside with a cup of coffee, looking unusually tense. "You are late," Linda said automatically before glancing at her watch and realizing Nora had actually arrived 10 minutes early. Without apologizing, she simply turned and walked inside. The dining room slowly filled with the familiar breakfast crowd. Coffee brewed, bacon sizzled on the grill, and country music drifted softly through the speakers. Nora focused on her work, greeting every customer with the same gentle smile she offered the day before, even those who had watched her humiliation without saying a word. Around 8 o'clock, the businessman in the charcoal suit returned, carrying the same leather briefcase and the same confident expression. Victor Hale chose his usual booth by the window and smirked as Nora poured his coffee. "Still employed?" he asked with quiet amusement. Nora nodded politely. "For today." Victor laughed. "You should stop trying to save the world. It is expensive." Before Nora could answer, a low rumble echoed from outside. At first, nobody paid attention. Delivery trucks often stopped nearby during breakfast hours. But the sound continued growing louder until conversations gradually faded. One customer stood and looked through the front window. Another followed. Then the entire room seemed to turn toward the parking lot at once. 3 glossy black sport utility vehicles rolled slowly into the lot before stopping in perfect formation. Seconds later, Two more arrived behind them. Every vehicle looked identical, polished so perfectly that the morning sunlight reflected across their dark paint like mirrors. Linda frowned. What in the world is this? The front doors opened almost simultaneously. Men and women in tailored business attire stepped out with quiet discipline, each wearing small communication devices and scanning the area with calm precision. There was no panic in their movements, only purpose. The room fell silent. Even the cook leaned through the kitchen window to see what was happening. Victor set down his coffee cup, suddenly far more interested than amused. One of the visitors opened the rear passenger door of the lead vehicle. A tall white man in his early 40s stepped onto the pavement wearing a perfectly fitted navy suit. His posture radiated confidence, but the exhaustion beneath his eyes suggested he had not slept all night. He paused for only a moment before looking directly at the faded diner sign above the entrance. Then he walked inside. The tiny bell above the door chimed softly. Every eye followed him as polished shoes crossed the worn wooden floor. Nobody spoke. Linda hurried forward, instantly replacing yesterday's impatience with practiced hospitality. "Good morning, sir. Welcome." The man acknowledged her with a polite nod before asking a single question in a calm, unmistakably authoritative voice. "Is Nora Bennett here?" The room seemed to stop breathing. Linda blinked in confusion before pointing toward the coffee station where Nora stood frozen with a pot still in her hands. Victor slowly turned toward her, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to visible uncertainty. Nora looked from the strangers to the man in the suit, searching her memory for any explanation, but she had never seen him before. He smiled gently, though emotion lingered behind his composed expression. "Miss Bennett," he said, taking one respectful step closer. "My name is Ethan Blackwood. I believe you met my father yesterday." For several endless seconds, nobody moved. The only sound inside the diner was the steady hiss of the coffee machine and the faint clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug. Nora stared at Ethan Blackwood, trying to connect his composed face with the exhausted man she had served the day before. The realization never came because she had never imagined there was anything unusual about him. "Your father?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded, his voice calm but weighted with relief. "Richard Blackwood is my father. He disappeared yesterday morning. We have been searching for him across 3 counties all night." A ripple of whispers spread through the dining room. Victor Hale frowned as the name settled into his mind. Linda Brooks instinctively straightened her uniform, suddenly aware that nearly every visitor standing outside carried themselves like executives rather than ordinary travelers. Ethan continued without taking his eyes off Nora. "Late last night our investigators recovered his notebook. Your name was the only new name written inside. He wrote that a waitress named Nora Bennett reminded him that kindness still existed. That sentence brought us here." The room fell silent again. Linda looked from Nora to Ethan, then back again, struggling to reconcile the quiet employee she had criticized only hours earlier with the center of such extraordinary attention. Victor slowly lowered his coffee cup onto the table, no longer wearing the confident smile that had followed him into the diner. Nora felt dozens of eyes resting on her, yet she answered with the same gentle honesty that had guided her the day before. "I only bought him lunch." He seemed cold and hungry. Ethan smiled faintly. "Most people saw an inconvenience. You saw my father." One of the security directors stepped forward and quietly handed Ethan a tablet displaying surveillance photographs from different locations. Ethan glanced at the images before turning back toward Nora. "Can you tell me everything that happened after he arrived?" Nora carefully described the rain, the soup, the conversation, and the mysterious sentence Richard had spoken before leaving. When she repeated the words, "Some kindness always finds its way home," Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. "He used to tell me that when I was a child," he said softly. "He has not said those words in years." Emotion briefly crossed his face before his businesslike composure returned. "Did he mention where he was going?" Nora slowly shook her head. "Only that someone was already looking for him. I assumed he meant family." Ethan exchanged a quick glance with one of his advisors. "That means he still wanted to be found." Hope quietly spread through the group, standing behind him. Linda finally gathered enough courage to step forward. "Mr. Blackwood, if there is anything our restaurant can do to help, we would be honored." Ethan acknowledged her politely without changing his expression. "Thank you. Right now I simply need the truth." His attention returned to Nora once again. Would you be willing to show us exactly which direction my father walked after leaving here? Nora hesitated for only a second before nodding. Of course. She reached for her coat, hanging near the kitchen entrance. As she did, Victor unexpectedly stood from his booth. Gone was the amused businessman who had mocked compassion the previous afternoon. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Miss Bennett," he said, avoiding direct eye contact. "I may have judged you unfairly yesterday." Nora offered the same quiet smile she had given every difficult customer. Everyone has difficult days. Victor lowered his head, realizing that the woman he had considered insignificant possessed something money had never taught him. Outside, the line of black sport utility vehicles waited with engines idling beneath the bright morning sky, and as Nora stepped through the front door beside Ethan Blackwood, every person watching sensed they were witnessing the beginning of a story far greater than anyone inside that humble diner had imagined. The convoy moved slowly through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls with Nora seated beside Ethan in the rear of the lead sport utility vehicle. She had never ridden in a vehicle so silent or so carefully engineered. Outside, curious residents paused on sidewalks to watch the line of black vehicles pass, wondering what could possibly bring such an extraordinary presence to their small town. Inside, Ethan listened without interrupting as Nora described every detail she could remember. She recalled the direction Richard had taken after leaving the diner, the pace of his walk, the brief glance toward a narrow pedestrian trail beside the river, and the peaceful expression he wore despite the rain. Ethan studied a digital map, while one of his security directors marked every location she mentioned. "There is a walking path that follows the water for almost 3 miles, Nora explained. "If someone wanted quiet, they might choose that route." Ethan nodded immediately. "Divide into 2 teams. Search both entrances to the trail and every park along the river." The instructions were spoken calmly, yet every person in the vehicle responded without hesitation. Within moments, messages were flowing through encrypted radios as additional search teams adjusted their routes. Nora watched the efficiency with quiet amazement. She had spent her life solving problems one paycheck at a time. Ethan solved them by coordinating dozens of people within seconds. Yet despite the obvious difference in status, he continued treating her with genuine respect. "Thank you for helping us," he said sincerely. "Most people would have considered yesterday an inconvenience. You never did." Nora looked out the window before answering. "My mother always believed people deserve kindness before they earn explanations." Ethan smiled faintly. "My father used to say something similar. Success tells you what people admire. Hardship tells you who they really are." The vehicle slowed as it approached the entrance to the Riverside Trail. Morning sunlight filtered through tall oak trees, illuminating damp grass still covered with droplets from yesterday's storm. Security personnel spread through the area with measured discipline, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. Nora stepped onto the path beside Ethan, recognizing the wooden footbridge she had passed countless times on her way home. "He could have come this way," she said quietly. They walked for several minutes until an elderly groundskeeper driving a small maintenance cart noticed the group. He removed his cap politely and looked toward Ethan. "Are you folks looking for the gentleman who spent the night near the old gazebo?" Every conversation stopped instantly. Ethan stepped forward. "You saw him?" The groundskeeper nodded. "Yes, sir. White hair. Worn jacket. Very polite. I offered to call someone, but he thanked me and said his son would eventually understand why he needed time alone." Ethan released a slow breath he had apparently been holding since the search began. "Was he all right?" "He looked tired," the groundskeeper replied, "but peaceful." Before sunrise, he walked towards St. Matthew's Chapel at the top of the hill. Ethan exchanged hopeful glances with his advisors. The tension that had filled every vehicle since the previous afternoon began giving way to cautious optimism. As they prepared to leave, the groundskeeper turned toward Nora with a puzzled smile. "You must be the waitress he kept talking about." He said the world still had hope because one young woman refused to measure people by their clothes. Nora felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment as every member of the search team looked toward her. No applause followed. No dramatic celebration interrupted the quiet morning. Only a deep silence settled across the riverside path, the kind that appears when simple goodness becomes impossible to ignore. Ethan looked at Nora with unmistakable gratitude before opening the vehicle door once again. "I believe we are finally going to find my father," he said softly. "And none of this would have happened if you had chosen to walk away yesterday." The convoy climbed the winding road towards St. Matthew's Chapel, where morning sunlight spilled across weathered stone walls and towering maple trees. The chapel had stood on the hill for more than a century, overlooking Cedar Falls with quiet dignity. Its wooden doors were open, and the soft ringing of distant bells drifted through the crisp air. Every vehicle came to a gentle stop. Ethan Blackwood stepped out before anyone else, his eyes fixed on the small building ahead. Months of board meetings, billion-dollar negotiations, and public confidence had never demanded as much courage as the few steps he now took toward those doors. Nora followed several feet behind, uncertain whether she still belonged in this extraordinary moment. The security team remained respectfully outside, sensing that what waited inside was no longer a matter of logistics, but of family. As Ethan entered the chapel, he immediately saw his father sitting alone in the last wooden pew. Richard Blackwood had changed very little since the previous afternoon except for the calm resting across his face. He looked toward the stained glass window where colored light painted quiet patterns across the polished floor. He did not appear surprised when Ethan approached. Instead, he smiled with gentle affection, as though he had known this reunion would eventually arrive. Ethan stopped beside the pew, emotion briefly overcoming every carefully practiced business instinct. "We have been looking everywhere for you," he said softly. Richard nodded without turning away from the window. "I know. Do you have any idea what everyone has been through?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying relief more than frustration. Richard finally looked at his son. Perhaps they experienced what ordinary families feel every day when someone they love disappears into loneliness, while everyone else is too busy to notice. The words settled heavily between them. Ethan lowered his eyes. He knew his father's recent retirement had left him surrounded by assistants, but strangely isolated. Meetings had replaced conversations. Schedules had replaced shared meals. Success had quietly crowded out simple moments together. Richard gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Yesterday, I wanted to remember whether people still saw humanity before status. Most did not." He paused before smiling again. One young waitress did. Ethan followed his father's gaze toward the entrance, where Nora stood respectfully near the doorway, unsure whether to enter further. Richard slowly rose and walked toward her with steady steps. "Miss Bennett," he said warmly, "thank you for treating an old stranger with more dignity than many people have shown Richard Blackwood in years." Nora smiled with quiet embarrassment. "I only did what anyone should have done." Richard shook his head gently. "If that were true, my notebook would not contain only one new name." The chapel became completely silent. Even the birds outside seemed distant for a moment. Ethan watched the exchange with growing admiration. He had spent his entire career evaluating intelligence, leadership, and ambition, yet none of those qualities had impressed him as deeply as the quiet humility standing before him now. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his borrowed jacket and carefully unfolded the paper napkin from the diner, the one Nora had handed him with his bowl of soup. It had been neatly flattened and preserved despite the rain. "This," he said softly, holding it between his fingers, "reminded me that compassion survives in places where prestige rarely looks." Nora's eyes filled with emotion, not because she expected recognition, but because she realized the lonely man she had served had carried such a small act of kindness with him through the entire night. Ethan stepped beside his father and looked directly at Nora. "My family owes you far more than gratitude," he said sincerely. "You helped us find him. More importantly, you helped him find hope again." Richard Blackwood invited Nora to sit with him on one of the old wooden benches, while Ethan quietly stepped outside to give them a few moments alone. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, casting gentle shades of blue and gold across the chapel floor. The silence felt peaceful rather than awkward. Richard folded his hands together and looked at Nora with the kind of attention that made people feel genuinely seen. "Yesterday," he began softly, "I walked away from everything that usually surrounds me. Security, chauffeurs, assistants, expensive offices. I wanted to know whether anyone would recognize simple human need without recognizing my name." Nora listened quietly, unsure how to respond. Richard smiled faintly. "Most people never looked at my face. They looked at my clothes. They decided who I was before I spoke." Nora lowered her eyes. I am sorry that happened to you. Richard shook his head. Do not be. Yesterday reminded me that wealth can purchase comfort, but it cannot purchase kindness. That still has to come from character. Ethan returned a few moments later carrying Richard's coat. His expression had changed since arriving at the diner. The urgency remained, but relief had replaced the fear in his eyes. Father, he said gently, everyone has been worried. The board has canceled every meeting. They only wanted to know that you were safe. Richard nodded with understanding. Then let us go home. Before anyone moved, Ethan turned toward Nora once again. Would you allow us to do something for you? Nora smiled politely. You already thanked me. That is enough. Richard chuckled warmly. People often mistake gratitude for repayment. They are not the same. Nora remained silent. She had never helped someone because she expected anything in return. Ethan reached into a leather portfolio handed to him by one of his advisors. Inside was a simple white envelope. He held it out respectfully. Nora looked at it, but did not take it. What is it? She asked. An opportunity, Ethan answered. Not a reward. Richard continued before she could decline. Last year, our family established the Blackwood Community Foundation. We have searched for someone to oversee a new outreach program serving small towns like Cedar Falls. We interviewed executives with impressive resumes. We met consultants with remarkable presentations. Yet yesterday, a waitress quietly demonstrated more leadership than all of them. Nora blinked in disbelief. I have never managed a foundation. Richard smiled. No, but you already understand the one qualification that cannot be taught. You naturally see dignity where others see inconvenience. Ethan opened the envelope and handed Nora a single page rather than a contract. It contained only an invitation to meet with the foundation board later that week. There were no financial figures, no legal obligations, only an opportunity to have a conversation. If you decide it is not for you, Ethan said sincerely, we will still remain grateful. Nora looked at the page for several long moments. She thought about her tiny apartment, the reduced shifts, the old sedan waiting outside the diner, and the countless times people had quietly dismissed her because her life appeared ordinary. None of those memories filled her with resentment. Instead, they reminded her why helping strangers had always mattered. She carefully folded the invitation and placed it inside her purse. I will come, she answered softly, but only if you promise one thing. Richard raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity. What is that? Nora smiled. The people we help should never have to feel embarrassed for needing help. Richard's eyes brightened with unmistakable admiration. Miss Bennett, he replied. That is exactly the answer I hoped to hear. Outside the chapel, the waiting executives watched through the open doors as the three of them walked side by side toward the morning sunlight. None of them could hear the conversation, but every one of them recognized that something far more valuable than a business agreement had just been formed. 1 week later, the small conference room at the Blackwood Community Foundation overlooked the skyline instead of a quiet roadside diner. Yet Nora Bennett carried herself exactly as she always had. She wore a simple navy dress, modest shoes, and the same gentle smile that had comforted an elderly stranger during a rainy afternoon. Around the polished table sat directors, attorneys, and senior executives whose careers had been built on impressive achievements. Many of them had quietly wondered why a waitress from Cedar Falls had been invited to meet with the foundation's leadership. By the end of the morning, none of them would ask that question again. Richard Blackwood opened the meeting himself. He did not begin with financial reports or strategic plans. Instead, he placed a single folded paper napkin in the center of the table. Several board members exchanged puzzled glances. Richard smiled warmly before speaking. This ordinary napkin reminds me of the most valuable investment I have seen in decades. He looked toward Nora. A woman with very little gave without expecting anything in return. Every mission statement we have written means nothing if we cannot live by that example. The room became completely silent. Ethan then introduced a new community initiative designed to support food programs, emergency assistance, and neighborhood partnerships across small American towns. When he announced that Nora had accepted the position of Community Outreach Director, there was no applause at first. There was only thoughtful silence as people understood why she had been chosen. She had not earned the opportunity through influence or connections. She had earned it through character. Months passed, and the changes spread far beyond Cedar Falls. Nora visited shelters, local diners, schools, churches, and community centers, listening far more than she spoke. She insisted that every family seeking assistance should be welcomed with dignity rather than suspicion. Volunteers were trained to offer respect before paperwork. Reception areas were redesigned to feel warm instead of intimidating. Richard often smiled whenever he watched the programs grow, knowing that one quiet decision inside a small diner had inspired thousands of others. Back in Cedar Falls, Linda Brooks also changed. The memory of that rainy afternoon stayed with her long after the black sport utility vehicles disappeared from the parking lot. She apologized sincerely to Nora and gradually transformed the atmosphere inside the diner. Employees were encouraged to treat every customer with patience, regardless of appearance. A small community meal program quietly began every Wednesday evening, funded jointly by local donations and the Blackwood Foundation. Victor Hale returned one afternoon, no longer carrying the confidence that had once disguised his arrogance. He sat in the same booth by the window, but this time he waited until Nora finished greeting another customer before standing. "I spent years believing success meant recognizing opportunity," he admitted honestly. "You taught me that success begins by recognizing people." Nora smiled with the same quiet kindness that had never depended on who stood before her. "We all keep learning." Richard Blackwood occasionally visited the diner without an announcement, ordering the same bowl of soup that had changed his perspective. He always insisted on paying, and he always left a handwritten note beneath the tip. One autumn afternoon, he looked around the busy restaurant where strangers now greeted one another more warmly than before and quietly said, "Amazing things happen when one ordinary act refuses to become ordinary." Nora glanced through the front window at families laughing together beneath golden leaves drifting across the sidewalk. Her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined, but the most important part of her remained exactly the same. She still believed every person deserved to be seen before being judged, and on that quiet afternoon, surrounded by people who finally understood the true measure of dignity, the world seemed to remember something it too often forgets. The greatest fortunes are never measured by what we keep, but by the kindness we choose to give when no one expects us to give it.